My name is Hannah, and this is my year of less stuff. Hey y'all, welcome to me filming a tag video, which is something that I almost never do. I skip most beauty YouTube tags just because I never want to film something if I really feel like my heart's not in it, and I don't have that much interest in most tags. But this one has gripped my interest. I've really been enjoying watching some of my friends' versions of this tag, and I decided to sit down and do it today. I have had a few extra days in between videos lately. I just haven't been able to be as productive as I have pretty much for most of the past month and a half. I've been in a little bit of a dip. I feel like what's going on globally has been kind of getting to me a little bit over the past couple days. I think we're in this weird phase, and maybe it's just me or the people that I speak with frequently, but I've been hearing from a lot of people and feeling myself as well, like things are starting to feel like this is the new normal. Like we've been in this situation long enough that some of what made me feel freaky outy before has settled in, and I kind of feel numb to it. But at the same time, I feel like being numb to the weirdness of my everyday situation is opening up room for me to feel more acutely like the tragedy, the global scale of the tragedy. So I've simultaneously been feeling like a little bit less uncomfortable in my daily life, a little bit less weirded out by my daily life, and a little bit more sad, like on an existential scale. And I feel like I've been using up a lot of energy to readjust to that, and it's just been keeping me from filming. So I recently delivered my check-in video, which was a doozy, and then also my video about how I spent my budget in April. Both of those took also a lot of energy for me to film, so there's been a little bit of a lull for all of those reasons. Because of the last two videos, there was space surrounding them, and just because of where I'm at right now. So what I'm doing is I'm gonna retreat to the corner of my channel, the place on the spectrum of my channel that I feel like is the lightest, the one that's easiest for me to film about, the stuff that's easiest for me to film about, and it's where I go when I want to just kind of deliver pure entertainment without feeling like I am getting too stressed out or feeling like it's too emotionally laborious. And that is just the realm of makeup and talking about makeup. And so this tag came along at the perfect time. It's the eyeshadow palette tag. I'm going to be talking about my eyeshadow palettes. The tag was started by Ali Glines and Samantha March, my dear friend Samantha, and I've really been enjoying, again, watching people do it. I'll try to link other people's versions of this video down below because it's a really fun one. But before we get into the meat of the video, I have completely failed to continue telling you guys, giving recommendations about people to follow. It was something that I was going to try to start doing in every video, and it's worked out that I only remember to do it every 10th video. But I don't want to put off any longer telling you about what I think I can safely say is my favorite Instagram account that I follow. Everybody, listen to me. Artie the Android. Artie the Android. What are all of us even doing with our lives if we're not paying attention to everything posted by Artie the Android? I love this makeup artist. I love this person. Everything they post is incredible. I feel like I cannot even do justice to Artie's work. I'm just going to put some of their pictures up on the screen right now and let them speak for themselves. The looks, the photo editing, the aesthetic, the grunge, also the consistency with which they post. They deliver constantly beautiful imagery. And I feel like every time I scroll through my Instagram feed, when I see Artie the Android's work, that is the moment when I get that feeling of just this is what makeup can do for us. I feel connected. I feel this artistry. I feel this power, this humanity. I mean, you guys, just go follow Artie the Android. They're killing it. They are slaying the game. They're effing me up every single day. I worship this artist. That is all I have to say in the introduction, but I do want to tell you about my own makeup look. I'm going to do it in the meat of the video. Let's go ahead and get into the meat of the video. All right, we're in the meat of the video. If you really don't care about me and my makeup look and you just want to know about how I feel about my palettes, then I'll put a timestamp down below so you can skip this introduction to the meat that's inside of the meat. I just feel like it's different what I have going on today. Maybe it doesn't look that different to you, but I feel like it. And also the inspiration came from a really interesting source, which is this. My silly family, we've been doing weekly Zooms, and maybe I also feel like I have a lot to say right now because I haven't filmed in a while because of everything that's been going on, and because I had filmed those other more beefy videos like a while back, and it took me a long time to edit them and get them up and to get like brave enough to post them to deal with the emotional fallout of posting them. So I feel like we have a lot to talk about. So a couple of weeks ago, we had prom for my cousin. Her prom was canceled. She's a senior in high school. So when we all came onto the family Zoom, we were all dressed up for prom. And it was so funny. I mean, I think it was funny on an unexpected level. Like, it was unexpectedly funny to see what everybody came up with. It's 5 different households all Zooming in together. So my mom, my dad, my sister and her boyfriend, Joe and me, and then my family in which that cousin lives, aunt, uncle, 2 cousins. So these 5 households all Zoomed in together, and we were all decked out for prom, kind of like all with different concepts of how prom should go and like different levels of fanciness. And it was so amazing that at the end of that call, we decided that this weekend, this most recent weekend, this past weekend, which was the following week for us at that time, we would also theme our Zoom, but that each household would come up with its own theme, a secret theme, and that the goal was to show up at the Zoom and have the theme be so explicit and clear that everyone else would be able to guess what the theme was. So Joe and I decided on a Jane Austen theme, like sort of Pride and Prejudice theme. And I'll put a picture up right here of how we ended up looking. We actually we hung up like a quilt that we have that has a green back, and we turned it into a green screen wall, and Joe downloaded these amazing backgrounds, and we like really went the distance. We really went for it. And Joe even like shaved some sideburns into his face. He didn't shave them in, but he shaved the rest of the hair off so that there were sideburns. He gave himself sideburns. And I don't know, we didn't really plan it very well. And then just like an hour before the chat, we were like, oh no, we have to scrape together these Jane Austen costumes. And given that it was so hasty, I feel like we really knocked it out of the park. I'm like still glowing with pride about how amazing we ended up looking. The relevance to my makeup look today is that I have not dyed my eyebrows for a very long time because I ran out of the dye kit. I didn't realize I had run out of dye. So I went for an extra long time because, you know, I'm in quarantine and I just haven't thinking about it that often. And then really my eyebrows have kind of gone back to their natural coloring. Like, it's all really washed out. They're very pale right now. And then I went to dye them and I didn't have the dye. So I've continued really to revert to like my natural, very pale brow. And I've been filling them in when I've been on camera with a pencil, but for this Jane Austen look, I didn't fill them in, of course. I just brushed them up with a little bit of the Patrick Ta brow wax and left them looking really, really natural. And there is something about the way that it ended up looking. It's the opposite of what my brow aesthetic has been for the past several years. The sort of like thick, bushy, dark brow that I've been going for. This is the total opposite. But I really fell for it when I was putting that costume together. So that's what I have on today for my brows. And it's not just the brows, it's the whole thing. So very, very high, thin, natural, light brow that's brushed up delicately and not filled in at all. So it really looks in a weird way like penciled on or sparse because of the hairs themselves being like the only material of the brow. And then a completely blank lid, a lot of mascara, but only on the upper lashes, and a very strong cheek and a sort of semi-natural lip. This lip isn't as natural as the one that I had for the actual Jane Austen look, but I pretty much replicated. When I was putting that look on, I was like, this is so different from anything that I would just wear on camera, but I've been really enjoying wearing it in the everyday, and I decided to put it on. So that's the look that I have on today. It's like a slightly YouTubed up version of the Jane Austen makeup look that I had on for that Zoom. So here are my palettes. There are only 10 of them. I have 7 palettes and 3 ROEN quads, and I decided to include the ROEN quads in the video. Those quads are marketed as palettes. That's what they're called by the brand. And I just thought, why not? I actually feel like the way in which this tag is trying to elicit information about like our aesthetic, individual people's aesthetics, and what we lean on and what we gravitate to. I feel like for the purposes of making the tag be as informational as possible, it makes sense for me to include these quads because I really like them and I use them a lot. But it's going to be really interesting for a couple of reasons. I feel I haven't decided about anything yet. I was like, I only have 7 palettes and 3 quads. So I feel like I can decide on the fly. I can decide with you guys. I don't think that it's a thing where I'm going to have to like sit there thinking and thinking and thinking. And I think that because I have so few palettes compared to other people who I've seen do this tag, even seeing me think through making the decisions will make sense as part of my completion of the tag. And then there's the fact, so I was saying that the fact that I haven't chosen the answers yet maybe will make this like a dynamic version. And then the fact that I have so few palettes compared to other people I've seen do this will also make it different. And I think that maybe the dynamic quality of the video that comes from seeing me make the decisions will help make up for the fact that I have so few palettes and you guys have seen them over and over again. Hopefully it's not too boring. Show your newest palette. Of the ones here, my newest is definitely the ROEN.REVIEW quad, which I purchased for the purposes of review with my channel budget. It was a self-sponsored review. I'll try to remember to link that down below. It was a fun video, very, very, very thorough review, and also it ended up being kind of like a funny dynamic video in and of itself. So it is worth watching. I feel like it's worth watching. Who stars in it, who produced it, who edited it, feel like it's worth watching. And who really, really loves this palette. So yeah, this is the newest addition to my collection. Surprisingly, I have something pretty new to put in this category because with the exception of this one, I don't even really remember the last time I acquired a palette, like one of these palettes that's here. So I'm glad that I actually was able to answer that question. Show your oldest palette. I think that my oldest palette must be the Natasha Denona Lila palette. I don't think that this is the oldest to me. I don't think that I received it into my life before I received any of my other palettes, but I inherited this palette from Lauren, my friend Lauren with the YouTube channel Lauren May Beauty. She purchased it for herself with a gift card, I think, a long time ago when it was new or when it was almost new, and she didn't end up getting along with it and she gave it to me. So I think that this is the palette that was purchased the longest ago of all of the palettes in my collection, purchased by Lauren. But I think I probably already owned the gold palette by the time she gave this to me. I will say though that the oldest palettes in my collection have been dismantled and turned into singles. So the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette, some ColourPop palettes that predate all of the ones that I have here, all of the 10 that I have here before me, and some Juvia's Place palettes that Angelica gave me as a gift. I think that probably the ColourPop palettes that I purchased and then turned into singles at the end of 2017, right before my no-buy year. I still own some of those palettes as singles, or I still own most of the singles from some of those palettes. Those are the oldest eyeshadows that I have in my collection, and those are the palettes that I've kind of like retained for the longest. But they're not palettes anymore, they're singles. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's a little weird for me to think of this being the oldest palette in my collection, or even the gold palette being the oldest palette in my collection, because I don't feel like I've had it for that long. I've had it for like a year and a half. But I do have these palettes that I've retained in singles form that I've owned for many more years than any of these. Show your most expensive palette. These are probably tied. So the Natasha Denona Gold palette and the Lila palette, I think that they're both at that $129 price point that Natasha Denona has for this size of palette. Show your most affordable palette. I think that the Kaleidos little skinny palettes, this is the Kaleidos Futurism Sci-Fi Green, and the Nabla Cutie palette, I think these retail for the same amount. I think that they both retail for $24. So in terms of how much the palette costs, these would be tied for the most affordable. They're both $24. But because oh no, they have the same amount of shadows. 6 shadows in this one and 6 shadows in this one. So they are exactly tied. Okay, the next bullet point says show your everyday palette. But I know from having watched several people do this tag that there's a later question that says to show your most used palette. And I have spent some time, or I did spend some time when I was watching those videos kind of idly thinking about the difference between those two things. Because I feel like for me, my everyday palette is the one that I reach for when I'm not doing anything like in any way artistic or conceived of. So if I sit down and I'm like, I'm gonna do a thing with my eyeshadow today, a lot of times I let my mind range over my entire palette collection, or I push myself to reach for a palette that I don't reach for as frequently as the other ones, or I push myself to reach for color, or I go into my singles. And then my everyday palette, I would usually consider that to be the one that I just grab for when I want to put something on my eyes and I know I want it to look great and I want it to be just like very me, very easy, very beautiful, but just like every day. And also something casual enough and neutral enough that I wouldn't feel weird putting it on if I was just having a very normal everyday type of day. That's usually what I would think of as my everyday palette. And for that, I would pick the Rowan 75 Degrees Warm quad, because this to me is definitely my everyday palette. It's just my like throw it in the bag, throw it on the eyes, blah, blah, blah. But I also think that this is my most used palette. I mean, the gold palette is pretty beat up, like it's pretty worn out. It's very used. You can see that when you look at it. But I think that probably per use, like use per its lifetime, numbers of use according to its lifetime, the amount of times I've used it since I've had it, gosh, I don't know. I think that this and the gold palette, it's hard to tell which one it would be. I'll wrestle with it more when I get to that question. But the point is that I felt like I wanted to distinguish between my most used palette as my everyday palette and the palette that I consider to be my indispensable go-to palette for all purposes, like the one that I lean on as a practical tool, because that's not this. This is like my everyday palette just for like smashing onto my eyes and going. But the one that I consider to be like my indispensable tool is the Persona Identity 2 palette. This is the one that I feel like I always need it there. I feel like every look that I do, whether it's an everyday look, casual, easy look, or a more elaborate look or a look for filming, this is like the artist's palette that I always have there, that I'm always reaching into for a buffing all over the lid shade, for a black, for a brown, any color, a grungy version of pretty much any color. I just feel like this, in another way, is like my everyday palette, because it's sort of like a I don't know what I would do without it kind of thing. It makes my life so much easier and I just really lean on it. So I'm gonna give this one the award for my everyday palette, because I feel like it holds a really, really important and sort of dense position in my group of 10 palettes. The next directive is to show your most colorful palette. I think the Identity 2 palette must also be my most colorful palette. It's got a red, a yellow, a green, a blue, a purple. It's the most rainbow palette. There's something about the colors in the Natasha Denona Sunrise palette, the yellows and the reds, that I feel like when I look at this palette, I think that I would get a very colorful look, like a very red look, or a very red and yellow look, or purpley look. And then also the Natasha Denona Lila palette, I feel like is one where I could get a really colorful look. I think of those as more colorful palettes, but neither of them has like green or blue, right? Yeah, neither of them has really green or blue. And this one does have the red and the yellow and the purple as well. So this is probably also my most colorful palette, which isn't the thing really that makes it my everyday palette. I feel like what makes my everyday palette is the fact that the shadows are such high quality and they're so dependable. And there's also a black and a brown and a shimmery brown. And there's also like a neutral, very pale bone shade that's matte. There's a similar shade that's shimmery. And then there's like this mid-toned buff beige color. that's kind of what makes it so useful. And then the fact that there are these colorful shades in it as well makes it like doubly, triply useful, because it's like it can do everything. But curiously, it's not the fact that it's my most colorful palette that is the main reason that it's my everyday palette. It's almost like that's just an added bonus. Show your smallest palette. The Rowan quads are my smallest. They're all tied for my smallest palettes. I think that the only thing smaller is like my Tom Ford cream and powder duo, but there's just no world in which you could consider that a palette. It's like a cream that has a powder on, a cream shadow that has a powder on top. It's just a little single. So these are going to be my smallest. They're groups of 4, they're quads. Show your biggest palette. The Natasha Denona palettes are my biggest, aren't they? There's 15 shades in these. Oh no! The Alter Ego Daydream palette has 18 shadows in it, and that's more shadows than the Natasha Denona palettes. So if we're talking about biggest, meaning the most shadows, it's not necessarily physically bigger. There's the Lila palette behind the Daydream palette. So the Lila palette and the gold palette are physically bigger, but this is the palette that has the most shadows in it. That's so interesting. I don't really think of it as a big palette. I do really, really like this palette. It's the textures and those like neutral but exciting colors. That palette gets me every time. Show your palette with the best memory. I think it's probably the gold palette, because it was a Christmas gift from my sister, and my sister's like my favorite person, and I love getting gifts. It's like my favorite thing. Receiving this as a gift did have that special holiday feeling. Like, you know, that feeling that, well, I don't know if you know, but I feel like there was a feeling about Christmas and about gift giving and about wanting special things that you couldn't afford for yourself, and then magically maybe receiving them as gifts, or receiving one of them as a gift on the holidays. There was a feeling about that I feel like was more potent in childhood, and just maybe more a part of that season in childhood. And then as you move into adulthood, it kind of tapers off or is much more rare. And I feel like this actually did give me that feeling. And so I think that that's why I feel like it's the one with the best memory. I remember after receiving it as a gift, like the next morning, maybe it was on Christmas morning or Christmas afternoon, or the day after that, on Boxing Day, I had some time. And I just remember sitting in my dad's house in the living room and just like opening it and looking at it. And I had no reason to really wear it there, you know, out in rural North Carolina. I wasn't going to put it on. I just remember opening it and just like looking at it for a while and being like, wow, and just feeling my feelings and feeling myself and feeling really grateful. That's a great memory. Show a palette that's worth the hype. I don't know. Gosh, I don't know if I feel like any of my palettes have been super hyped. I think that the one that I feel like has gotten the most hype is the gold palette. And I feel like it's the one that I would most consider to be worth its hype on an artistic level. I have said before, and I maintain this, that if all of my makeup disappeared, I wouldn't buy the gold palette with my own money. It's just too much for me to spend $130 of my budget on a Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette. I've never purchased the Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette with my own money, and there's a reason for that. And I don't think that I could bring myself to do it, as much as I love the ones that I have and as good as the quality is for me. So I'm not saying that it's worth the money, but I do think that on an artistic level, it's worth the hype that it got. I think it's a really special palette, even among Natasha Denona palettes, because it has a relatively focused but very unique color story. So the color story is focused on gold, but gold has so many personalities. And so there's all of this dynamic range among the gold shades in the palette, but because they can all be considered versions of gold, it's very, very focused. But then she brought these blues in, these just really unusual, rich, greeny blues, greeny Prussian blues. And somehow the presence of these blues, because they're mixed with the yellows of the golds, they evoke the way in which gold can have a green quality. I just think that's genius. It's a kind of color genius that I very much admire. And it manages to also be a really neutral palette because it's got so much brown and bronze in it. So in terms of color, already it's earning the hype to me. But then you add in the fact that the textures of this palette are so incredibly dynamic. It ranges from everywhere to like sheer, really totally sheer shadows with glitter to unbelievably rich, creamy, almost like flaky metallics. And there's also a duochrome in here. There's this really slick, glittery shade in here. And there are these beautiful creamy mattes and just regular creamy metallics. It's just, I feel like she boldly went where no palette had gone before in terms of the way in which the color story is focused and also is like a story. Like the color collection, the curation of it is articulate. So she did that, and then she also went boldly where very few palettes were going at that time in terms of texture. She kind of blazed the way. So that is what makes it worth the hype to me. I feel like the fact that so many people have loved this or wanted this, and even people who aren't really that into Natasha Denona have found it to be admirable. I feel like people have continued talking about the gold palette long after its release. Those are the things that I'm using to sort of like say that it's been hyped. And I understand why it's gotten the hype that it's gotten. Show a palette not worth the hype. Oh, I know. Also by Natasha Denona, the Sunrise palette. I feel like this was really hyped when it came out. I feel like everyone went bananas, and I feel like a lot of people that I know on YouTube bought it. It was one of these things where it was like a no-brainer. Everyone was like,
I'm totally buying that because it's my exact color story. I just can't say no.
And also it was less expensive. It was like half the price because the shadows are half the size, the pans are half the size. Everyone got really hyped up over that as well. The fact is, it's just not that, it's just not that dynamic. It's got everything that I said about the gold palette, it fails at, I guess. I feel like there are a lot of colors in here that look really similar when they're on the eyes, and there's very little texture diversity. It's like there are some metallics and there are some mattes, and that's kind of it. I do think that the shadows are really beautiful. I just don't think that it was as well conceived, as artistically conceived, and it definitely was not boldly going where no palette has gone before in terms of color story or texture or anything. If anything, I feel like it was a little bit late to the party in terms of color story when it was released. So I don't feel like this was worth the excitement. This is one that I wrote off effortlessly when it was released. I had no desire to buy it. It was sent to me as a gift. It was sent to me in PR. And so I'm happy to have it because I love Natasha Denona and I really do like the shadows, but I don't tend to reach for this palette to make looks that are implied or dictated by these colors. I tend to reach for this palette to pop the shades out and use a couple of them at a time to create my own color story in palettes of singles. So I don't think that this is worth the hype it got. All right, show your favorite palette from a favorite brand. I don't know if my favorite eyeshadow brand is ROEN or Natasha Denona. I really love ROEN, and I am more inclined to buy from ROEN, but I think that because Natasha Denona has more range in her formula, she edges ROEN out in terms of like my favorite brand or like my favorite eyeshadows. And so repetitively, it would have to be the gold palette. Of the 3 Natasha Denona palettes that I have, Lila, Sunrise, and Gold, the gold is definitely my favorite one. I really love Natasha Denona's mattes. I struggled to work with them for a long time, but I finally kind of figured out that you just stick down the shadow exactly on the spot where you want it, almost like you're painting a wall, you know what I mean? Like painting a piece at a time. You just like paint it on exactly where you want the color and then softly buff out the edges rather than going in with like a bunch of shadow on a brush and like windshield wiper blending in the way that Jaclyn Hill showed me how to do all those years ago and just like magically hoping that it like diffuses out into the exact shape that you want. Her mattes don't work that way. It's a much more like paint by number, much more intentional kind of putting together of a look that I do when I'm using Natasha Denona mattes, and I prefer it. I prefer that way of applying eyeshadow, and her mattes have become my favorite. I feel like at this point, if I were to go, oh joy, if I were to go like on a vacation, on a trip, or like on an overnight, you know, if I were like able to go on some sort of little overnight and I was like grabbing a little makeup bag to take with me, or even if I was going like on a week trip, like to New York or to home for a visit with my family or something like that, I would grab a Rowan quad. That would be what I would take with me. It would be like my old reliable, something that I feel like I could use in any situation. I could apply it under any lighting conditions, and I would feel confident that it was gonna look like I didn't try too hard, because I wouldn't have tried too hard, but that it would give me something. Like I feel like I would just grab a Rowan quad and then I would be good to go. I wouldn't be taking my gold palette with me like that. So in that way, they are like my little precious jewels of choice. I just think that this is my favorite palette from a favorite brand. I think that that is the case. And then let's go ahead and say that for the last question, which is my most used palette, let's say that we can give that honor to the Rowan 75 Degrees Warm Quad for all of the reasons that I just stated. That at any given moment, on any given day, when the thing that I'm doing is just like any old thing, this is what I'm reaching for. And I do think that since I got this, I've used it more than I've used the gold palette. The thing that, if we're being very practical and like if we're gonna actually count it up, the thing that makes me not totally sure that I haven't used the gold palette more is just the fact that I've used this one shade, Kava, so much. I've used it so much. And I think I've probably used Kava more times than I've used the Rowan quad. It's partly because I've owned the gold palette for like twice as long as I've owned the Rowan quad. But I think that I've used this quad as a quad, like as it was intended to be used, meaning like reaching for it and creating looks that it implies, the looks that it delivers, the looks that it was built to allow a person to create. I feel like I've used this in the spirit of it more frequently than I've used the gold palette in the spirit of the gold palette to create gold palette-esque looks. So I think that the Rowan 75 Degrees Warm Quad can safely win the award of being my most used palette. And if I had picked Rowan as my favorite brand for this, this would have been the favorite palette from the favorite brand, because this is my favorite, followed closely by the 1111 palette, and then the 52 Degrees Cool is my third favorite of the three. That is it. And the cool thing is, all of the palettes got an award. Or no, they all got mentioned. I guess, no, all of them, except for maybe the 52 Degrees Cool Quad, didn't get an award. But all of the other ones did. I wasn't sure that that would happen. I guess there are 13 questions and I have 10 palettes. So there was a chance, right? There was a chance for everyone to get an award, but I wasn't sure that it would shake down that way because I hadn't planned it in advance. But I'm excited that it did, because I feel like you guys got to sort of see everything. But I'll hold it all up. If you're visual like I am, then that will be a better way for you to kind of see what I'm working with. That's all of it. Those are my 10 palettes, and that was the palette eyeshadow tag. Huge thanks to Allie and Samantha for coming up with this one. It was a fun one. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that you guys are doing okay. I mean, like I implied at the beginning of the video, it's just been a little bit of a, I feel like I've been entering a second phase of the weird times, and negotiating like a new set of stressors, and I'm sure that you are too. I hope that you're doing okay with it. And I'm hoping that by focusing on just some lighter makeup-oriented content over the next week or two, I'll be able to give you a little bit of a reprieve, a little bit of a distraction, a place to go and just zone out for a little while. I have a reckoning upcoming. I have to review those Fenty blushes. I might be able to do some empties, maybe some get ready with me's, those kinds of things. So stay tuned, and don't forget to take extra good care of yourself right now so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.